In 1985, a simple school trip turned into one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. 14 children disappeared without a trace, and for decades there was absolute silence. But now, 30 years later, something has been discovered. A school bus was found at the bottom of a lake. What really happened that day? Prepare for a revelation that will change everything you thought you knew. The morning of October the 17th, 1985, dawned with a clear sky over Mexico City. The crisp autumn air brought with it the promise of a perfect day for a school trip. In the courtyard of the Benito Juarez Elementary School, located in a quiet neighborhood south of the capital, fifth graders formed a disorderly line next to the yellow bus parked at the entrance. Teacher Carmen Sanchez, 34, took attendance with meticulous precision while the children chatted animatedly, unable to contain their excitement at escaping, even for just a day from their school routine. "Silence, please. We can't leave until everyone is present," exclaimed Carmen, raising her voice above the noise of the children. "Miguel Angel Ortiz, present, teacher. Lucia Hernandez, here I am." One by one, the 14 students selected for the trip responded enthusiastically. They had won this award for their outstanding grades during the first 2 months. A visit to the newly opened Interactive Science Museum, followed by a tour of Chapultepec Lake, where they would learn about aquatic ecosystems. Among them was Daniel Ramirez, an 11-year-old boy with an insatiable curiosity for everything related to nature. His mother, Sophia, adjusted his jacket while reviewing the instructions for the umpteenth time. "Remember to take your medicine after lunch and stay with the group. Do you understand?" "Always stay close to teacher Carmen." Daniel nodded impatiently. "Yes, Mom. You've told me 1,000 times." Sophia smiled and kissed him on the forehead. "One more doesn't hurt. I'll pick you up right here at 6 o'clock. Neither of them could imagine that this kiss would be the last they would share. A few meters away, Javier Mendoza, the driver assigned for the trip, was performing a final inspection of the bus. He was a middle-aged man with 15 years of driving experience and an impeccable record. He had worked for the school district for over a decade and knew every route in the city like the back of his hand. "Everything okay, Javier?" asked Director Felipe Guzman as he approached with a folder full of authorization forms. "As always, Don Felipe, the bus is in perfect condition. I just checked the oil and brakes. We'll get there and back without any problems." The director nodded with satisfaction. "Take good care of them. They are our best students." At 8:15 a.m., the 14 children, teacher Carmen, and driver Javier left the school amid laughter and goodbyes. Parents waved as the yellow bus rolled off down Main Avenue, disappearing into the city's morning traffic. No one could have foreseen that image, the bus moving away under the October sun, would be the last they would have of their children. The first stop was scheduled for 9:30 at the Interactive Science Museum. According to Carmen's meticulously planned itinerary, they would spend 2 hours there before continuing to Chapultepec Lake, where they would have lunch and take a guided tour. The return to school was scheduled for 5:30 p.m., allowing 30 minutes for possible traffic delays. At 9:45, when the bus had not arrived at the museum, the guide assigned to the school group called the school to inquire about the delay. Director Guzman assumed traffic was the culprit and asked them to wait a little longer. At 10:30, when there was still no sign of the bus, he began to worry. She called Carmen's cell phone, one of the first in the city, purchased specifically for field trip emergencies, but only received a message that the number was out of service. At 11:15, Director Guzman contacted the police. What followed was a search unprecedented in Mexico's recent history. Patrols patrolled every possible route between the school and the museum. Descriptions of the bus, the driver, and the 15 passengers were broadcast on all radio and television stations. Volunteers combed parks, side streets, and ravines in the surrounding area. But the yellow school bus with license plate SP1985, 14 fifth-grade students, a teacher, and a driver, had disappeared as if the earth had swallowed it. The first 48 hours were chaotic. The families of the missing people settled in the school that had been improvised into an operations center. Sofia Ramirez, Daniel's mother, was glued to her phone, convinced that at any moment she would receive the call that would return her son's message. "This has to be a mistake." she repeated in a broken voice to anyone who would listen. Daniel would never stray from the group. He is a responsible child. Something must have happened to them, something terrible. Theories began to multiply. Some speculated about a possible mass kidnapping, although no ransom demand ever came. Others suggested that driver Javier Mendoza may have intentionally diverted the bus, even though his personal and professional history showed no red flags. The most disturbing theory pointed to the possibility of an accident in some remote area. Rescue teams explored ravines and mountainous areas, but found no trace of the vehicle or its occupants. As the days passed, hope slowly turned to despair. Photographs of missing children plastered the city. Daniel with his shy smile, Lucia Hernandez with her perfectly styled braids, Miguel Angel Ortiz proudly holding a science trophy. 14 smiling faces that became the symbol of a national tragedy. A week after the disappearance, the investigation took an unexpected turn when a witness came forward at the police station. Eduardo Morales, a street vendor, claimed to have seen the school bus around 9 a.m. on the day of the disappearance, but not on the route to the museum, but rather heading in the opposite direction toward the highway that led to Lake Texcoco, much larger and more distant than the small Chapultepec Lake that was listed on the original itinerary. "I'm sure it was that bus," Eduardo insisted. "I looked closely because it seemed strange to see a school bus taking that exit. I even saw the teacher. She was sitting next to the driver, but she seemed, I don't know, a little worried." This testimony refocused the search toward the area of Lake Texcoco, a huge body of water on the outskirts of the city. Diving teams were organized to explore the most accessible areas of the lake, but the expanse was too large and the underwater visibility conditions too poor. After 3 weeks of intensive searching, authorities began to reduce the resources allocated to the case. By then, media attention had also waned, displaced by news about the reconstruction after the devastating earthquake that had shaken the city just a month before the disappearance. For the families, however, time had stopped on October 17, 1985. Sofia Ramirez left her job as a nurse to dedicate herself entirely to the search for Daniel. She sold her car to fund private investigators and traveled to every town near Lake Texcoco, showing her son's photograph to anyone who would look at it. "I can't give up," she confessed to a reporter on the first anniversary of his disappearance. "Every night before I go to bed, I promise Daniel that I will find him, no matter how long it takes, no matter where you are." A mother knows when her child is still alive, and I feel like Daniel is out there waiting for her to find him. Teacher Carmen Sanchez left behind an orderly life, a modest but cozy apartment, a collection of books carefully organized by author, and a dog named Neruda that her sister had to adopt. On his desk, they found a diary where he had written down his plans for the future. Study a postgraduate degree in pedagogy, travel to Spain during the summer holidays, perhaps adopt another dog so Neruda would have company. Javier Mendoza, the driver, was a widower and lived alone in a small apartment near the bus terminal. His colleagues described him as a calm and methodical man, passionate about mechanics and proud of his work. The night before her disappearance, she had called her only daughter, who was studying in Guadalajara, to tell her she was saving up to visit her for Christmas. None of them seemed to have any reason to disappear voluntarily. None had connections to organized crime or significant financial problems. They were ordinary people whose lives were frozen in time, that fateful October 17th. As the months passed, the official investigation lost momentum. The detectives assigned to the case were gradually reassigned to other, more recent cases with a higher chance of being solved. The Benito Juarez case file, as it was officially known, grew with reports, testimonies, and false leads, but without definitive conclusions. By the second anniversary of the disappearance, only one detective was still actively working on the case: Alejandro Vega, a stubborn man who refused to file it away among unsolved mysteries. He had promised the families that he would not give up, and he kept his word until a terminal illness forced him to retire in 1990. On his deathbed, Vega confessed to his son that he was also a police officer. "Of all the cases I couldn't solve, those children's cases are the ones that will haunt me beyond the grave. There's something that doesn't fit, something we're all overlooking. The answer is there, but we failed to see it." And so the mystery of the missing bus and the 14 children from Benito Juarez Elementary School became an urban legend, a tale parents told their children to warn them about the dangers of the world. With each repetition, the story became more distorted, adding fictional elements that obscured the painful reality. Meanwhile, deep in Lake Texcoco, beneath meters of murky water and sediment, a yellow bus rested silently, holding within it the answers so many had sought for so long. No one could have imagined that 30 years later, an unprecedented drought would reveal the first fragment of truth in this puzzle that had tormented an entire nation, and that this truth would be more surprising and moving than any of the theories that had circulated for decades. The daytime stood still for 14 Mexican families was about to find its explanation, an explanation that would forever change the way they remembered their lost loved ones and reveal a story of heroism and sacrifice no one could have imagined. Before I reveal the ending of this story, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. We're about to reach 5,000 subscribers, and only you can be part of this achievement. The first years after the disappearance were the most intense. The families of the 14 children joined forces to form the Benito Juarez School Parents Association. Every Sunday, they met in the parish hall of St. Augustine Church, sharing information, organizing searches, and above all, offering each other the comfort that only those who experience the same pain can offer. Sofia Ramirez naturally emerged as the group's leader. His fierce determination and refusal to accept official explanations inspired others. She had sold her house to fund the search for Daniel and was now living in a small apartment near the school, as if proximity to the last place she saw her son could somehow keep the connection between them alive. "I don't care what the police reports say," he declared at each meeting, pounding the table with the palm of his hand. "Our children are alive, and if the authorities don't find them, we will." Roberto Hernandez, Lucia's father, nodded firmly. He had quit his job as an accountant to devote himself entirely to the search. Every morning he set out in his old pickup truck, which he had painted with the faces of the 14 children, and toured towns near Lake Texcoco, distributing flyers and interviewing anyone who might have seen anything that fateful day. Yesterday, I spoke with a fisherman on the North Shore. He informed the other parents. He says that 5 years ago, he saw strange lights on the lake at night. "It could be nothing, but I'm going to investigate." That's how the meetings went. Week after week, month after month, every new lead, no matter how unlikely, was followed with desperate hope. Every rumor was exhaustively investigated. Every possible sighting of one of the children triggered immediate mobilization. On the third anniversary of their disappearance, the association organized a march through downtown Mexico City. Thousands of people joined, many of them with no direct connection to the victims, but moved by the persistence of these families who refused to give up. They took them alive. "We want them alive," they chanted as they marched down Paseo de la Reforma, carrying banners with the faces of the disappeared. The march culminated in front of the National Palace, where Sofia Ramirez, her voice breaking but firm, read a statement addressed to the president. "Mr. President, today we do not come as citizens asking for a favor. We come as parents demanding a right, the right to know what happened to our children. 3 years have passed, and we still have no answers. The investigation has stalled. The files gather dust. Meanwhile, 14 families live in a limbo of pain and uncertainty. We ask you, we demand that you reopen the case with all the necessary resources. We will not rest until we find them." The president responded with a public promise. A new investigative team would be formed. Additional resources would be allocated. Every detail of the case would be reviewed from the beginning. Over the next few weeks, it seemed as if something would finally change. New detectives visited the families, reviewed the original statements, and retraced the route the bus should have taken. New searches were conducted at Lake Texcoco, this time with more advanced sonar equipment, but gradually the initial momentum fizzled. Progress reports became sparser, calls from investigators became less frequent, and months later, when Sofia tried to reach the lead detective, she discovered he had been assigned to another higher priority case. "Another broken promise," she muttered as she hung up the phone. "It wasn't the first time, and I knew it wouldn't be the last." By then, cracks were beginning to appear in the family's unity. 2 of them had decided to hold symbolic funerals, a decision the others interpreted as a surrender, as abandoning hope. "How can you bury an empty box?" Ana Maria Ortiz, Miguel Angel's mother, asked anguishedly during a tense meeting. It's as if they're saying our children are dead. It's not that, Pedro Gomez, whose daughter Laura had been one of Lucia's best friends, responded gently. It's that we need to close a chapter. We'll keep searching, but we also need to keep living. The association continued, but it was no longer the united front of the early years. Some parents began missing meetings. Others moved to different cities seeking a new beginning, far from the constant memories. By the fifth anniversary, only 8 families participated in the commemorative march. Sofia Ramirez observed these changes with a mixture of understanding and unwavering determination. She understood the exhaustion, the emotional drain, the need for shield herself from the constant pain, but she didn't want to go on. Not while there was even the slightest chance Daniel was still alive somewhere. My son needs me, she explained to her sister, who suggested she consider moving away to start over. And if he comes back and can't find me, and if he's trying to get back home right now? The years passed, and with them came new challenges. The younger siblings of the disappeared grew up under the shadow of tragedy, some developing an almost suffocating sense of responsibility toward their parents, others rebelling against the pain that defined their homes. Carlos, Daniel's younger brother, who was only 4 years old when the disappearance occurred, grew up to become a police officer, driven by a desire to solve the case that had torn his family apart. I'm going to find him, Mom, he promised Sophia on the day of her graduation from the academy. I'm going to bring Daniel back home. Sophia smiled sadly, caressing the face of her youngest son, now a 23-year-old man. She saw in him the same determination that had kept her going all this time, but she also feared that the case would consume his life as it had hers. By the 10th anniversary, the story of the Benito Juarez children had become a cold case, one of many. Unsolved mysteries in police files. The media only mentioned it briefly on anniversaries, usually as a note at the end of newscasts. But then something unexpected happened. An independent documentary titled The Forgotten of the Lake rekindled public interest in the case. The director, a young filmmaker named Alejandro Fuentes, had grown up fascinated by the story, as his uncle had been one of the first divers to participate in the search in Lake Texcoco. The documentary not only meticulously reconstructed the events of that day and the subsequent investigation, but also featured new interviews with witnesses never before considered and raised uncomfortable questions about why certain leads weren't properly followed up. Because the connection to Lake Texcoco was never fully investigated, the narrator asked as the camera panned to aerial footage of the vast body of water. Why was the street vendor's testimony so quickly dismissed? And why did the investigation lose momentum just when it seemed to be getting closer to the truth? The documentary became a viral phenomenon. Initially screened at small film festivals, it was soon acquired by an international streaming platform. Suddenly, the case of the 14 missing children from the Benito Juarez school captured worldwide attention. For Sophia and the other families still actively involved in the search, this renewed interest brought a surge of hope. New witnesses came forward, people who had remained silent for years out of fear or because they didn't believe their observations were relevant. Among them was Martin Suarez, a former maintenance worker at the Texcoco Ecological Park, who claimed to have seen a yellow school bus parked near a restricted area of the lake on the same day of the disappearance. I didn't give it any importance at the time, he explained in an interview for a national television program. I thought it was part of some authorized excursion, but then when I saw the news about the missing children, something didn't add up. I tried to tell my supervisor, but he told me not to get into trouble. This new information led to a formal petition to reopen the case, supported by thousands of signatures collected online. The new Attorney General, under pressure from the media attention, announced the formation of a special team dedicated exclusively to solving the mystery. By then, 15 years had passed since the disappearance. The childlike faces on the wanted posters no longer corresponded to reality. If they were alive, the children would now be 26-year-old young adults, unrecognizable to those searching for them with faded school photographs. This reality hit the families hard when the research team requested DNA samples for possible comparisons. They were no longer looking for children, but adults who may not remember their previous life or remains that may have remained unidentified for all these years. No matter what we find, Sophia said at a meeting with the new investigators, We just want the truth. After so much time, it's all we ask for. The investigation progressed slowly over the next few months. New searches were conducted at Lake Texcoco, now using much more advanced technology than that available in 1985. Former employees of the ecological park were interviewed. Weather and water level records were reviewed. Historical satellite photographs were analyzed. And then, as the 20th anniversary approached, came the news that would change everything. During a particularly severe drought, the water level in a remote section of Lake Texcoco had dropped dramatically, revealing what appeared to be the roof of a large vehicle buried in the mud. Carlos Ramirez, now a detective, was one of the first to arrive at the site. As she watched forensic technicians work carefully to unearth what increasingly appeared to be a school bus, she felt a mix of conflicting emotions: hope for finally finding answers and fear of what those answers might reveal. "I need someone to call my mother," he said in a tense voice to his partner. "She should be here when they open it." Sofia Ramirez. Now a 60-year-old woman with completely white hair arrived at the lake 2 hours later. He stood on the shore, watching silently as the rescue team worked methodically. His face, marked by decades of pain and waiting, revealed no emotion, but his hands, firmly clasped across his chest, trembled slightly. At her side, Roberto Hernandez and Ana Maria Ortiz, the only other parents who had been actively searching for her all these years. They kept an equally solemn silence. They had imagined this moment thousands of times in their dreams and nightmares. Now that it had finally arrived, it seemed unreal, as if they were watching a scene from someone else's life. "It's the bus," the head of the forensic team finally confirmed, approaching the families. The license plate matches. September 1985. Sophia closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing the impact of those words. 30 years of searching, of stubborn hope, of refusing to accept what many considered obvious, culminated in this moment. "And is there anyone inside?" he asked in a barely audible voice. The coroner nodded gravely. "Yes, there are human remains, but we need more time to determine how many and to properly identify them." As the sun began to set over Texcoco Lake, turning the sky shades of red and gold, Sofia Ramirez sat on the shore, staring at the partially dug-out bus. 30 years of tears seemed to condense into this moment of inevitable truth. What no one could have imagined at the time was that the bus not only contained answers about the fate of the missing, but also a story of heroism and sacrifice that would completely transform the narrative of that tragedy. A story that would begin to unfold when, among the remains, they found a hermetically sealed metal box containing a diary written by teacher Carmen Sanchez, miraculously preserved by the conditions of the lake. The last words of his final entry read, "If anyone ever finds this, please know that Javier did everything he could to save them. What happened wasn't his fault. He was a hero, and I want the world to know it." The summer of 2015 struck Mexico with one of the most severe droughts in decades. News reports showed images of cracked farm fields, starving livestock, and reservoirs reduced to muddy puddles. Lake Texcoco, already diminished by years of overexploitation and climate change, shrank dramatically, revealing swathes of land that had lain submerged for generations. It was Ernesto Valdivia, a 32-year-old biologist monitoring the effects of the drought on the lake's ecosystem, who made the discovery. He'd set out early that July morning before the heat became unbearable to take soil samples from recently exposed areas. "Something doesn't add up with these readings," he muttered to himself as he compared the data on your tablet. Levels of certain metals in a specific area were abnormally high, suggesting the presence of some artificial object buried in the mud. Intrigued, Ernesto deviated from his planned route and walked toward the area in question, a grayish, cracked expanse of land that until a few weeks ago had been under several meters of water. The sun was already beating down hard, and the scientist could feel the sweat soaking his shirt as he struggled across the uneven terrain. It was then that he saw a piece of rusty metal sticking out of the dried mud. At first he thought it might be part of some abandoned structure, perhaps remnants of the old drainage works that had been built on the lake decades before. But as he approached, his heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a pipe or a piece of machinery. It was the corner of what appeared to be the roof of a large vehicle, and despite the corrosion and mud, a yellow color could be seen. With trembling hands, Ernesto picked up his phone and dialed the emergency number. "I need to report a finding," he said, trying to remain calm. "I think I found a bus buried in the dry bed of Lake Texcoco." The operator on the other end of the line appeared confused. "A bus, are you sure?" "No, not at all," Ernesto admitted. "I only see part of it, but from the size and shape, yeah, I'm pretty sure it's a bus. Is there any indication of how long it's been there?" Ernesto looked again at the rusted metal, the accumulation of sediment, the way the vehicle seemed to have blended into the landscape. "A long time," he replied. "Years, maybe decades." 4 hours later, the area was cordoned off and bustling with activity. Police, firefighters, civil protection personnel, and a preliminary forensic team examined the area while a small excavator began carefully removing the hardened mud surrounding the vehicle. Among the new arrivals was Detective Carlos Ramirez. At 34, Carlos had specialized in missing persons cases, driven by the trauma that had defined his childhood. The disappearance of his older brother, Daniel, along with 13 other children and 2 adults, in 1985. "What do we have so far?" Carlos asked the forensic technician overseeing the excavation. "It's definitely a school bus," the man replied, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "And from what we can see from the license plate, it seems to be quite old. We're working on clearing the back where the full number should be." Carlos felt his stomach tighten. He didn't want to get his hopes up, not after so many false indications over the years. But he couldn't stop his mind from returning to those photographs of the yellow bus with the license plate SEP 1985, which he had obsessively studied since joining the police force. "Let me know immediately when you have the full number," he ordered, trying to keep his voice from betraying the emotional storm he was feeling. He walked a few steps away and took out his phone. He hesitated a moment before dialing his mother's number. Should I tell him something now or wait for confirmation? Sofia Ramirez had suffered too many disappointments over the years. One more could be devastating. Finally decided to send him a text message. "Mom, there's a developing situation that may be related to Daniel's case. Nothing is confirmed yet. I'll call you as soon as I know more." He had barely put away the phone when he heard a scream from the excavation. "Detective Ramirez, come quickly." Carlos ran back. The forensic technician held a cloth with which he had cleaned part of the bus's rear license plate. "SP 1985, he read aloud. "It's the bus, Detective. It's the one they've been looking for 30 years. The world seemed to stop for Carlos. 30 years of unanswered questions, fruitless searches, theories and speculations culminated in this moment. The bus that had taken his brother, that had destroyed his family and 13 others, had finally appeared. "I need you to proceed with extreme caution," he said, regaining his professional composure. "This is potentially the scene of a crime that has remained unsolved for 3 decades. I want photographic documentation of every stage of the excavation, and no one, absolutely no one, opens that bus until the full forensic team is here." The next few hours passed in a strange mix of contained urgency and meticulous precision. As the sun set over the lake, powerful spotlights illuminated the scene, allowing the work to continue. Journalists began to gather around the police perimeter, attracted by rumors of an important discovery. Carlos kept the media at bay, refusing to confirm or deny anything until they had more information. But internally, he knew it was only a matter of time before the news leaked. The Benito Juarez school bus, which disappeared in 1985 with 14 children, a teacher and a driver, had been found. Finally, around midnight, the vehicle was sufficiently exposed for the forensic team to examine its exterior in detail. The bus was remarkably well preserved, considering the circumstances. The lake's low oxygen, water, and sediment conditions that had sealed the vehicle had slowed the decomposition process. "Let's try opening the main door," announced the head of the forensic team. A middle-aged woman with decades of experience recovering evidence in extreme conditions. Carlos nodded, feeling his heart pounding painfully against his ribs. This was the moment he had imagined since he was a child, the moment his mother had waited 30 years for. The door, swollen and warped by decades of underwater exposure, resisted the initial attempts. Finally, with the aid of hydraulic tools, it was opened with a metallic groan that seemed to echo through the tense silence surrounding the scene. The beam of flashlights penetrated the dark interior of the bus, revealing mud-covered seats, objects scattered in the center aisle, and, most shockingly, silhouettes that clearly belonged to human remains. "Oh my God!" someone on the team whispered. Carlos stood his ground, even though he felt his legs might give out at any moment. "Proceed with standard protocol," he ordered. "Complete documentation before moving anything." While forensic photographers, as they began their work, Carlos stepped back a few steps, needing a moment to process what he was seeing. After 30 years, they finally had answers. But those answers brought with them renewed pain, the definitive confirmation of what many had feared but refused to accept. No one had survived. His phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a message from his mother. "Any news?" Carlos closed his eyes for a moment. How could he tell her this? How could he confirm that the hope that had kept her going for 3 decades had been in vain? Before he could decide how to respond, one of the forensic technicians urgently called after him. "Detective, you need to see this." Carlos returned to the bus. The technician was holding a small metal box, the kind used to store important documents, protected from water. "We found it under the driver's seat," he explained. "It's sealed tightly. It might have preserved its contents." Wearing gloves, Carlos took the box. It was surprisingly heavy for its size. The label, though faded, was still legible. "In case we find it, please hand it over to the authorities. Carmen Sanchez." A chill ran down Carlos's spine. The teacher had left a message, a testimony of what had happened. After 30 years of speculation, they would finally have the truth directly from someone who was there. "We need to open this under controlled conditions," she said, handing the box to the head of the forensic team. It could contain crucial evidence. As the box was carefully packed for transport to the lab, Carlos made a decision. He called his mother. "Mom," he said when she answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting by the phone. "We found it. We found the bus." The silence on the other end of the line was profound. When Sophia finally spoke, her voice sounded strangely calm. "They are." "Yes," Carlos replied, unable to pronounce the exact words. "But there is something else." The teacher left a box with a message. "We don't know what it says yet, but we will soon. We will soon know what really happened that day." 3 days later, in a forensic laboratory in Mexico City, the box was opened in the presence of Carlos, his mother, and representatives of the other families. Inside, protected by layers of sealed plastic, were several notebooks and a small recording device, one of the first portable models available in the 1980s. The lab technician connected the device to special equipment designed to recover audio from old or damaged media. After several minutes of adjustments, the voice of Carmen Sanchez, the missing teacher, filled the room, clear and firm, despite the passing of 3 decades. "My name is Carmen Sanchez, a fifth-grade teacher at Benito Juarez Elementary School. If you're hearing this, it means you found the bus. It means they can finally know the truth about what happened to me, Javier, and my 14 students on October 17th, 1985. What I'm about to tell you is difficult, but I need the families to know that their children were brave until the very end, and that Javier Mendoza was not responsible for our tragedy. On the contrary, he did everything humanly possible to save us." The recording continued to reveal a story that no one had imagined, a story that would forever change the way Mexico would remember the Benito Juarez school tragedy. A story of unexpected heroism, sacrifice, and a bus driver who demonstrated extraordinary courage in the most extreme circumstances. As Carmen Sanchez's voice narrated the events of that day, Sofia Ramirez took her son Carlos's hand and held it tightly. After 30 years of tears and tireless searching, they would finally know the truth, a truth that, although painful, would bring with it something they had long lost, the peace of knowing. The forensic lab room fell into absolute silence as Carmen Sanchez's recording continued. His voice, miraculously preserved for 3 decades, told a story that no one had imagined. It was approximately 9:15 in the morning when it all began, Carmen narrated in the recording. "We had left school at 8:15 and were heading to the Interactive Science Museum. The children were excitedly singing songs in the back of the bus. Javier drove with his usual caution. The teacher described how they suddenly noticed the sky darkening rapidly. What had started as a sunny morning turned into an unexpected storm. The forecast hadn't mentioned anything about rain," Carmen continued. But within minutes, we were in the middle of a downpour so intense, we could barely see through the windshield. Javier slowed down, concerned for our safety. That's when they made a decision that would change their lives forever. Rather than continue toward the museum under such dangerous conditions, Javier suggested temporarily detouring to higher ground near Texcoco Lake, where they could wait for the storm to subside. We thought it would be the safest thing to do, Carmen explained, her voice cracking slightly. We never imagined that storm wasn't a normal phenomenon. What followed was the story of a natural disaster that had never been connected to the disappearance of the bus. The storm turned out to be an extreme meteorological phenomenon, an isolated but extremely intense storm cell that dumped more than 200 millimeters of rain in less than an hour on a very specific area. The water began to rise around the bus with terrifying speed, Carmen continued. Javier tried to turn around, return to the main road, but it was too late. The road we had come along was completely flooded. In the laboratory room, Sofia Ramirez held her son Carlos's hand tightly, tears silently running down her cheeks. After 30 years of imagining kidnappings, murders, or escapes, the truth turned out to be a natural tragedy, a terrible accident that no one could have foreseen. The recording went on to reveal how Javier Mendoza had taken control of the situation with extraordinary calm and determination. Javier ordered us to remain calm. He had the children move to booster seats while he tried to maneuver the bus to higher ground, but the engine stalled when water reached the exhaust. What followed was a harrowing account of how the driver tried to call for help using the bus radio, but the storm interfered with the signal. When water began to seep into the vehicle, Javier made a heroic decision. He told us he was going to look for help, Carmen said. He took off his jacket, gave it to Miguel Angel, who was shivering from the cold, and promised us he would return with rescuers. He ordered us to stay on the bus, where we would at least be protected from the current that was already carrying trees and debris outside. Carmen's voice cracked completely as she recounted how Javier had gotten off the bus, fighting against the increasingly strong current. It was the last time they saw him alive. The children were scared, but they behaved with incredible courage. Continuous. Daniel set up a system for the little ones to take turns in the higher seats. Lucia led songs to keep morale up. Miguel Angel distributed the sandwiches we brought for lunch, making sure everyone got an equal share. As the recording progressed, those present in the lab listened with a mixture of horror and admiration, as those 11-year-old children had faced an impossible situation with surprising maturity. The water kept rising, Carmen said when she reached the seats. We took refuge in the rear of the bus, which was slightly elevated. Hours passed and Javier did not return. We began to fear the worst. The teacher described how as night fell, the situation became desperate. The storm continued with relentless intensity. The water had almost completely flooded the interior of the bus, forcing them to gather in the small, dry space at the top. That's when we saw the lights, Carmen said, her voice suddenly animated. Lights in the distance moving in our direction. We thought it was Javier who had gotten help. The children started screaming and waving their arms, but it wasn't Javier or the rescuers. It was a search helicopter hovering over the flooded area. Carmen described how they had used the bus's emergency flashlights to try to get their attention, but the heavy rain and darkness made it impossible to be seen. The helicopter passed by, she said in a muffled voice. It was our darkest moment. The children began to cry, understanding for the first time that we might not be rescued. What followed was perhaps the most poignant part of the story. Carmen described how in the face of extreme adversity, those 14 children showed the best of humanity. They shared what little dry space remained. They took turns holding the most tired. They told each other stories to keep hope alive. Daniel told us about the stars we couldn't see through the storm, reciting from memory the constellations that fascinated him so much. Laura shared the candies she kept in her backpack, one for each of them. Miguel Angel made us laugh by imitating the school teachers, but the situation was unsustainable. The water kept rising, pushed by the incessant rain and the overflowing lake. Carmen recounted how at some point during the night, they felt the bus move. At first, we thought it was the current pulling us along, she explained, but then we realized we were sinking. The ground beneath the water-saturated bus was giving way. At that moment, Carmen made a decision. Using the small recorder she carried to record observations during the museum visit, she began documenting what had happened. storing the tape and her notes in the waterproof metal box she normally used to protect school documents. "I don't know if anyone will ever find this," she said, her voice now calm, almost resigned. "But if they do, I want the families to know that their children were brave until the very end, that they cared for each other like true brothers, and above all, that Javier Mendoza did everything humanly possible to save us. If he didn't come back, it was because he gave his life trying." The last words of the recording were barely audible, like if Carmen had been recording until the last possible moment. "The water is still rising. The children are asleep now, exhausted. I've secured the box as best I could under my seat. If you find us, please tell our families that we love them and that we weren't afraid at the end. We were together." When the recording ended, the silence in the lab was so thick it was almost touchable. Sofia Ramirez, who had maintained her composure throughout the narration, finally broke down, crying against her son Carlos's shoulder. "My boy," she murmured through tears. "My brave boy." Roberto Hernandez, Lucia's father, stood up slowly, as if the weight of the truth was too much to bear sitting down. 30 years, he said hoarsely. 30 years blaming the driver, imagining that he had betrayed us, that he had kidnapped our children. And all this time, he was a hero, concluded Ana Maria Ortiz, Miguel Angel's mother. He died trying to save them. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Forensics completed the recovery of the bus wreckage and its occupants. DNA testing confirmed what they already knew. The 14 children and their teacher Carmen had died that October night in 1985, trapped on a bus that slowly sank in the swollen waters of Lake Texcoco. But one piece of the puzzle was missing: Javier Mendoza. He had died trying to find help. Where were his remains? The answer came a week later, when search teams, now working with renewed purpose, found human remains almost 2 kilometers from where the bus had been. Dental identification confirmed it was Javier. Most surprising was what they found with him: the remains of a smashed emergency phone and a soggy map, but still legible. Javier had made it as far as an emergency telephone booth on the main road, but the storm had knocked out the lines. He was returning to the bus, presumably to inform Carmen and the children, when the floodwater surprised him. He died trying to get back to them, the coroner explained to Carlos Ramirez. He didn't abandon them. He was returning to be with them until the end. This revelation completely transformed the narrative that had dominated for 3 decades. Javier Mendoza, long suspected of having some responsibility in the disappearance, now emerged as a tragic hero who had given his life trying to save his passengers. A month after the discovery of the bus, a mass funeral was held for the 16 victims. Thousands of people filled the Metropolitan Cathedral and the surrounding streets. Mendoza's coffin, draped in the Mexican flag, was carried by Carlos Ramirez and the siblings of other missing children, a symbolic gesture of reconciliation and recognition. During the ceremony, Sofia Ramirez took the pulpit. At her age, with completely white hair and a face marked by decades of pain, radiated a serene dignity. "For 30 years I searched for answers. I searched for those to blame. I searched for my son. Today I finally have peace. The peace I hoped for, because Daniel will not return to my arms. But the peace of knowing that my son lived his final moments bravely, surrounded by friends, caring for others even in the face of extreme adversity." He paused, looking directly at Javier Mendoza's daughter, who had traveled from Guadalajara for the funeral. "And I have the peace of knowing that Javier, whom many of us unfairly blamed for years, was actually the hero who tried to save them all, who gave his life in the attempt." To his family, I can only say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the doubts, the accusations, the additional pain we caused you. His father was a hero, and Mexico will never forget his sacrifice. In the following months, the story of the Benito Juarez children and the heroism of Javier Mendoza captured national and international attention. Books were published, documentaries were produced, songs were written about their bravery. The place where the bus was found became a memorial. 16 trees, one for each victim, were planted in a circle around a central sculpture, a school bus with angel wings emerging from the water. But perhaps the most significant legacy was the Mendoza Protocol, a new set of safety guidelines for school field trips that included GPS tracking systems, redundant emergency communications, and detailed crisis procedures. Never again, declared the Secretary of Education during the presentation of the protocol. We will never lose our children again without knowing what happened to them. Never again will a family have to wait 30 years for answers. For Carlos Ramirez, who had dedicated his police career to solving the mystery of his brother's disappearance, the discovery brought a strange mix of closure and new purpose. He established a foundation in memory of the 16th, dedicated to improving child safety and emergency response systems. Daniel would be 41 years old now, she reflected during the foundation's inauguration. I like to think he would be proud of what we've accomplished in his name, that his story and the story of his classmates and his brave protectors will continue to save lives long after all of us are gone. And so, 30 years after a tragedy that shocked a nation, the truth finally came out. It wasn't a story of evil or criminal negligence, as many had feared, but one of extraordinary bravery in the face of impossible odds. A story of a bus driver who gave his life trying to save his passengers, of a teacher who maintained calm and order until the very end, and of 14 children who in their final hours showed the best of humanity, compassion, generosity, and a courage that would transcend time. The forgotten heroes of the Benito Juarez School had finally found their place in Mexican history, and though their lives were tragically short, their legacy would live on forever. Vin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like it, and share it with your friends. To the video and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next stories. See you next time.